the very processes that lead to aging, that lead to what we're seeing on the surface, like our hair getting gray and skin sagging, these very processes are the ones that exposure to hormetic stress is repairing and mitigating. And it is so profound to me, the overlap between the two, because good stress is the most holistic approach to healthy aging, in that we can counter all 9 of these hallmarks of aging simply through a good stress lifestyle.
Welcome, friends. Today's guest is a true friend and colleague in lifestyle medicine, Dr. Sharon Bergquist. Dr. Bergquist is an award-winning physician, researcher, and professor who has helped lead numerous clinical trials, including the Emory Healthy Study and the Emory Healthy Brain Study. She received her Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry from Yale College and a medical degree from Harvard Medical School. Dr. Bergquist is widely published in peer-reviewed journals and a frequent guest on Good Morning America, CNN, ABC News, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR. Today marks the release of her new book, The Stress Paradox, which is already grabbing a lot of attention. She's just back from the news studio with Dr. Sanjay Gupta to join me on the Healthspan podcast. We'll discuss common misconceptions about stress and its effect on aging. It's a continuation of our conversation on the Whole Health Cure podcast, which she hosts, and Dr. Bergquist will bring some rare substance to understanding stress at a deeper and more actionable level than you've likely heard previously. I think you're in for a real treat. Let's get at it. Sharon, welcome to the program. Great to have you on the Healthspan podcast today.
It's an absolute pleasure being here. Thank you so much.
So you and I have a bit of a history in terms of lifestyle medicine, in terms of crossing paths, and you were kind enough to have me on your podcast last year, I think. And so I'm just excited to be able to continue the conversation, and we can focus on you this time.
It's always fun.
So what timing of this in terms of release date is going to be coming out the very day that you have a new book coming out. Can you, I don't know if you can reach there to flash it out. I'll put it on the screen, don't worry. So congratulations on the book. Maybe you can just give us a quick highlight of the book, and then we'll kind of get into what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so you can see the book in the background right here is The Stress Paradox, and it's really a book that's at the intersection of lifestyle medicine and regenerative medicine. It's the lifestyle things we can do with the common thread amongst them being stress that activate our body's natural ability to prevent disease and help us become younger.
Cool. Yeah. And so it's really a something in here for everybody, no matter what age you are or where you are interested in going. I think we're going to have some things will be of interest. So I kind of gave people the little bit of a background of who you are, and I'd like if we could maybe just before we get into it here, mainly because it's quite unique in terms of the number of areas that you work in on any given day is not typical. So maybe you can kind of give us an idea, or maybe over the course of a week, kind of how you move in the different areas of your profession.
So one of the privileges of being in academic medicine is that your job can include a lot of dimensions. I do clinical work. I take care of patients, which is really kind of the heart of what I do in medicine. I also do research and administrative work and some teaching, a little bit of both. And I find that each makes me better at the other. You know, the questions that you ask in a research realm are really ones that come up in the clinic, and what you take away from the research you can apply to the clinical. So it's really a beautiful synergy of how it all works.
Yeah, and I think like we all do that in terms of if we're practicing, but the difference is we're kind of bouncing it over to another group of people. We're waiting for it to come back from some other direction we never know. You get to actually run that in a fairly tight loop and get quick feedback much quicker in terms of how the rest of the world would operate. So I think that's it's really a good, I would imagine, for keeping you grounded and kind of teaching. You can kind of get up there and say almost anything you want. But at some point the rubber hits the road, and we need to actually check ourselves. So that's awesome. So the main thing we're going to talk about today is stress, and I think kind of taking it one level down is really talk about hormesis and kind of how that really plays into stress in a way that is meaningful. I kind of go back to, I think, Dr. David Sinclair probably helped raise hormesis up for people who didn't know anything about the word previously. So maybe we can just start with, so we bring everybody to the same level to start with hormesis. Let's just give us the definition or the working definition of what is hormesis and as it relates to stress.
Now, I think of hormesis as the science of good stress. The term hormesis is from the Greek word to excite, and it's how certain types of stress, which are generally mild to moderate, followed by recovery, can activate parts of our body that help us grow, they enrich us, they help us become stronger. So, this is good stress, which is very different than the types of stress that I think we are used to in our lives.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example of how words change, right? We can point to all sorts of words that have different meanings now or different implications or interpretations than they did a decade or two ago. So my background's engineering, and in my early work, I was a stress analyst. I traveled all around North America, so that's what brought me to your area, to Atlanta a few times. But I was also really interested in people's life experiences. And so I would kind of, I think, was a pretty good listener when people wanted to talk. And they thought I was a psychologist. And I said, no, not that kind of stress. This is like the bridge is falling down and things. And, um, and so when we think about stress, it has these negative connotations. But clearly there's a lot of good stress as we start to get into it. One of the examples, I don't know if from an athletic standpoint, the easy example I like to use is training for a marathon. Would be a relationship people could have to understand you don't go from rest for 364 days and then try to go do your marathon on day 365. How's that going to work out for you? Right. So there's a training. So that's why I kind of explain it in a simple terms to people around. This is kind of what we're doing with it. So let's go back in your history a little bit. There's a common theme that I see with many physicians is the events that happened in their childhood were at the time not realized, but had a big factor, but played a big role in where they ended up in practicing medicine. So maybe you can share your story because I think it starts somewhere else outside the U.S., which I think has an interesting flavor to it.
Yeah, so I was born in Tehran, Iran, and we lived there in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution. And very rapidly, over the course of months, a lot of protest really unfolded. There was a lot of civil unrest, political unrest, religious unrest. And very quickly, we realized we had to leave the country. So our lives were essentially turned upside down in a very short amount of time. We were actually the last airplane to leave before Khomeini came to Iran. And after that, the airports were shut down. And, when you come to a new country, it's a new language, it's a new culture. When I had started eighth grade, I could barely write a paragraph in English and ended up, graduating valedictorian when I was a senior. So you're rapidly just learning and trying to figure out a lot of things. And in that process, I think the seeds of some of the questions I had in my professional life came. The question that I wondered is, why do some people get thrown in these situations and it becomes a strength, which I view my childhood as a strength? And why do some people get left in a situation where that was adversity for them? And throughout their lives, it has ramifications psychologically and physically. And so it really instilled this obsession for me of understanding stress and understanding resilience. And in that process, what I have learned, and it's really is that it's not anything special about me or other people who grow from these experiences. We all have the capacity to grow from stressful situations. It's in our DNA. It's a gift we have inherited from our ancestors. It's simply knowing how to summons our human potential to do this. And that's what I hope to share with other people.
Yeah, as you're talking, one of the really strong examples I use would be survivors of the Holocaust.
Mhm.
So if you look at one of the largest populations, when I say population in terms of survival rates of people living past 100, are in Israel. Right? And they so at that era they would have been Holocaust survivors, and and I think that's kind of contrary to the way we typically think in the West of this kind of no, you don't want to have any stress, right? We can wrap everybody up in bubble wrap and think that we're doing a good thing, and it's this learning to fall and get back up is helpful. Falling and breaking but you don't want to have it where you're breaking a limb in the course of fall, right? That's in the kind of in the big picture where we're trying to describe the stress is movement or whatever it might be in a dose. We say dose makes the poison or it makes the cure, right? And so all of this is we're going to talk about the dose aspects, right?
Right. And that's a perfect analogy because I view stress and specifically good stress as medicine. And that analogy of what's the right dose, what is the right kind, how are you prescribing it, is perfect because I think it's the strongest medicine that we have.
So maybe one that good example what people would think of the hormone cortisol. So maybe you can kind of give that as an example of kind of how that relates in terms of how we would interpret good or bad stress, because most people would think cortisol is, oh, that's all bad, right?
You know, if you listen to social media, you would think that cortisol is bad, but the reality is that our bodies do not have a moral code. How we elicit certain hormones and chemicals in our body determines their effect on us. So we really have to look at what were the circumstances under which we told our body to release cortisol, and that is a huge difference. So you mentioned before this analogy to training, like for a marathon. Invariably, when you exercise, you will get a spike of cortisol. The more intense the exercise, the bigger the spike. That spike in cortisol is necessary for your body to build the adaptations to exercise, meaning building the muscle, the endurance. If you blunt that cortisol spike, you blunt the benefit of the exercise. You don't get the adaptation. So spikes of cortisol are not always bad, right? We also know that exercise spikes your blood pressure, it spikes your heart rate, but that doesn't make exercise harmful. Your basal level, right, your baseline returns to a lower heart rate, a lower blood pressure, and a lower cortisol level. So we have to think about our chronic cumulative exposure to these chemicals, not these brief spikes. If our cortisol level is perpetually high and we have disrupted our body's natural rhythm, where our body has diurnal variation, meaning cortisol is highest in the morning, lowest in the evening before bedtime. If we disrupt that natural rhythm, that is when we run into the harms of the same hormone cortisol. So it can benefit us and it can hurt us depending on how we elicit it.
Yeah, and so that whole balancing system, right? So you're talking about one of thousands of balancing systems that are going in the body every minute of every day. So maybe one more common to people might be thinking about blood glucose, right?
Mm-hmm.
As though low blood glucose is what is best. Well, you don't get energy into your cells if you don't have enough glucose in your blood at the same time. But what we hear about is always the high blood sugar and diabetes. Clearly, that's an issue. But even then, it follows a cycle, just like virtually every hormone in our body follows cycles, either based on our our 24-hour circadian clock, or by the activities that associated with eating cycles, and when we eat, certain things happen, and there's just constant rebalance. I describe particularly hormones as like a big chemical plant, but we make 100 different chemicals, for example, on any given day. And byproducts of one are used to make another chemical. And so it all kind of fits together, and they don't all run at the same rate every day. We kind of move it around. But over the course of 24 hours and weeks and months, it absolutely looks like balance. But as you go into it, each one is following a cycle to help the other one out, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to not throw out terms such as we want to boost a certain hormone, chemical, vitamin, or that we want to dampen, for example, cortisol, because sometimes that's good and sometimes it's harmful. And we have to be so careful about this terminology because you can definitely go down a path where you're hurting your health if you're always boosting a certain chemical or hormone, etc. More is not always better, and sometimes dampening is problematic as well. And I think these simple solutions to do you want this hormone up, do you want this down, don't exist. You want the natural rhythm. You want to work with your body, not against your body.
Yeah, it's kind of that maybe that notion of movement where we associate physical movement being healthy, but in terms of movement of the levels in your body following the natural rhythm, as opposed to, yeah, if it's never moving, I can't think of what. I mean, sure, there's some that like your blood volume stays pretty regular, if again, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, most things are going to move around. Um, one of the one of the areas which I think certainly for those of us interested in the longevity side of health span, perhaps, but clearly that I talk about the two fairly interchangeably, but is in terms of biological age, and that's or biological clock. Um, since Steve Horvath came out with his clock, that's probably a decade ago now, at least. There's been many clocks come out. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit. I know you've written about this as well in terms of hormesis and kind of stress and our biological age, and maybe just and set it up so make sure everyone knows what we're talking about because I kind of skipped over it.
Sure. So, what we're talking about is that your biological age can be different than your chronological age. Some people are aging faster than their chronologic age, and vice versa. And we now have the ability through these biological clock models to get a sense of how a person is aging, their biological clock. So the first generation ones, Horvath and Hannum, they were trained using age as how they were trained upon. So they weren't certainly was a huge advance, but they're now second generation clocks that are looking at factors that can impact the aging process above and beyond chronologic age. So the way these clocks work is that through a blood sample, we can look at changes epigenetically in our DNA. So, one tube of blood through these microarray assays can capture up to 950,000 sites in the genome, epigenetic marks. And these big data microarrays are then combined with AI driven mathematical models that essentially impute a biological age. So, however, you want to train these models based on whatever algorithm you give them, you get a slightly different biological age. And that's where a lot of the research and patenting of different algorithms lies is how can we get the most accurate one. And epigenetic changes happen over a lifetime. What is really becoming interesting to me is rate of aging, the Dunedin pace clock being what I'm referring to in particular, because our ability to affect that in a short time frame is actually greater than lifelong epigenetic changes that we measure in a biological clock. From a clinical practical perspective, when I work with my patients, the question I want to know and they want to know is when they make a lifestyle change, let's say a dietary change where they've introduced more plant food, what is the effect of that on their rate of aging? So the Dunedin pace allows us to get a better sense of how an intervention like a dietary change has impacted a person's rate of aging in a fairly short time scale. So I think we're going to continually get iterations of these biological aging models. So I think that's a really fascinating area of medicine and longevity medicine. And to answer the second part of your question of this intersection between stress and biological age, there is such a deep connection between the two. When we expose ourselves to stress at a cellular level, we can repair and regenerate our cells. And the coolest part is that we, at this point, also know the processes that are involved in the aging. There are 9 hallmarks of aging, things such as genomic instability, epigenetic changes, telomere attrition, loss of proteostasis, and we can certainly go into detail on all 9 of them if you'd like. But the high level is that the very processes that lead to aging, that lead to what we're seeing on the surface, like our hair getting gray and skin sagging, these very processes are the ones that exposure to hormetic stress is repairing and mitigating. And it is so profound to me, the overlap between the two, because good stress is the most holistic approach to healthy aging, in that we can counter all 9 of these hallmarks of aging simply through a good stress lifestyle.
Yeah, and to kind of give people a moment to soak on that, because that statement you made, I think, is the basis for all my work. Because everyone wants to know, well, what's the one thing I should do that's going to give me the most benefit? And sorry, I'm not going to answer that question, because the one thing is many things, and your many things in terms of that makeup is going to be different than the person sitting beside you and different than mine. And we'll get into hopefully a little bit of that. And it's and I guess like one of my frustrations, I'll say, in medicine in general, in terms of and how we view medicine, is we have this binary model of I have a headache, take an aspirin, and 20 minutes later my headache's gone. It's a very binary. There's yes, I take a pill. There's that side of it too. Few things work as simple as the aspirin. We wish every medication developed since then worked as well and was as inexpensive and readily available as aspirin. It is such an outlier. It probably is responsible for a whole lot of drug research that continues today. People are still chasing the next aspirin. But it's hard to imagine on the outside looking in that all of these processes are happening in parallel. And so maybe we can kind of go into the types of stressors that we're talking about, to maybe start to understand why they work together. And I kind of, so I say, like in the MEDAC, in the mind, environment, diet, activity, and community, it's the same approach in that any one of them isn't particularly helpful. Yes, each one is helpful, but it's the interaction or the interdependence when they start to work together, and they naturally want to work together. So go ahead. You look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, there's so much to say. I completely 100% agree with that, because each of the lifestyle interventions, in your model or with good stress, triggers pathways that are so synergistic and overlapping, that you can think of it as, the more you do, it becomes fireworks, right? This is like a cascade that you're triggering, and you can amplify the effect through the synergy. And that's what you ultimately want. I mean, our body takes these multiple inputs, and that is how our physiology developed, to becoming its best. Like, it's never been one pathway, and if you just take a drug for this pathway, you are going to solve all your problems. And the reason what we're both describing in terms of lifestyle helps so much is because you are affecting the very core of your physiology, right? The very essence, you are affecting how your genes get expressed. And that's what good stress is doing. When your body senses good stress, it sends off molecular signals that trigger switches that are master regulators that affect the genes that we express. Um, so it's a very fundamental way of changing our internal milieu inside our body. And there just simply is not ever going to be one drug, one pathway that can mimic that. And the good stressors that I talk about or encourage is the commonality here is that these hormetic stressors were the stressors our ancestors were exposed to. And they are things like plant chemicals, the phytochemicals in plants, exercise, and specifically high intensity exercise, exposure to heat or cold, doing a pattern of fasting that I hesitate to even call fasting because I feel like it's such a normal eating pattern, but it's eating in a time restricted way that's 12 or less hours with most of the calories eaten earlier in the day to match our circadian biology, and also exposing yourself to good mental and emotional stress, things that kind of speak to your soul and are the kind of stress where there you are outside your comfort zone, but there's clearly a reward and purpose for enduring that stress. And the reason I focus on these five stressors is that we have conserved genes. We call them vitality genes or vita genes. And good stressors activate these vita genes, and they have the ancient secret code of how we get our cells to repair, to reduce inflammation, activate our antioxidant response. We have the ability to recycle damaged cells. We increase our energy production with this pathway. And that is the commonality that we have conserved these genes, and they are so crucial to our survival that they've been handed down now for over 2 million years. We share them with plants and animals. I mean, this is such a fundamental core part of our physiology. And stress is the key that unlocks it. And, certainly, the reason I'm so passionate about this is that for the first time in human history, right now, we are living a life where we have removed these stressors. They are no longer part of the fabric of our lives. And we are handicapping our own ability to be naturally healthy. So that's a very long explanation of your question.
Yeah, it's a yeah. So I was thinking. So if for a listener you got lost in that, so one of the ways I'd speak to that is in a way people maybe is easier to relate to is the body will adapt to almost anything we ask of it. And adaptation includes both. I'll go back to the marathon example. The same person sitting here at age whatever that person is today decides to train for a marathon in, we'll say, a year from now and goes through a training cycle, their ability a year from now will be dramatically improved relative to starting from where they were. And we'll say where they were was average, whatever average is. They lived what we'll call a normal life. The alternative is that person becomes more sedentary, and perhaps they've had an injury, right? And they're no longer able to move. And all else stays about the same. So muscle will atrophy because it's no longer being asked to do it, right? So we know that so I'll give you an example. I had a tendonitis issue in an elbow, and so I thought I'm going to rest it. Well, as I kept busy doing other things, a year went by and it never got better. So finally, I went to physical therapy, and of course, the answer whenever you go to physical therapy is strengthening. But I've been protecting it. Yeah, how did that work for you? Yeah, you're right. And so naturally, but the difference between one arm and the next was dramatic, all else being the same, just by favoring it. So in that simple example, I think most people can figure it out. these exact same things are happening with every cell in our body, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental principle here is bioplasticity, which is the biological equivalent of use it or lose it. And it works in both directions. So, just as you mentioned, you can lose a lot of muscle. The good part and the kind of hopeful, uplifting part is you can very quickly gain it. And so, wherever anybody is listening, we all have this potential to build the muscle. And I think of resilience essentially as a muscle.
Yeah, and it's so in the studies that I do, where I'm kind of looking at ideally the later life outcomes, where you kind of see, and then you look back on that history, and so what absolutely we see, no matter what age you are, you could be 80 years old and start resistance training, you will see benefits surprisingly quick. You will unlikely get to the point of someone who's been doing resistance training steadily for 50 years, but you don't need to be at that level, right? They're at a level beyond where we need to from a survival standpoint. But yeah, it's a and so the other place we see it is again in athletics, age group performance levels continue to be increasing, and so we while everyone focuses on the 100-meter record for the Olympics, I can tell you there's a lot of people focusing on what's the 100-meter record for over age 90, and it's continually being broken. It's not simply that there are more adults. They're starting to those who start to tie in to see the benefits once they start to practice some of these things we're talking about, they start to see they're on a very different trajectory than their peers, right?
Right. And the important thing here is that our culture today is giving our body the signal of we're on this decline part of the use it or lose it. I mean, that's really the key here is that without realizing it, we are giving our body the rest that you were trying to give your injury. And it's inherent in our culture because this comfort that has just creeped into our lives where we don't need to move as much. We have readily available foods. We live in climate controlled environments. We have food preservation technology. We have refrigeration. We have no need to go long periods without food. All of these comforts, I mean, certainly they have added tremendous quality of life. There's no question we have benefited from this. But what we don't realize is the hidden cost where these comforts are a risk factor for the escalating rise that we're seeing in chronic disease and in premature mortality. And that's really the key. I think even if conceptually we realize that we grow from, pushing ourselves, weightlifting grows muscle, what I think we aren't realizing is that the way we are living our lives today is not going to the gym, if that's the analogy. And that's the default because of all the rapid changes that have occurred in the last 100 or 200 years. And that's really profound because we take that as the normal and we assume that that is, how we should be living our lives. And this is such a wake up call for us that we need a major course correction because we are on the part of the use it or lose it. That's the downhill that we are losing resilience.
Yeah, it's a so again, I'll kind of pull back to the data that I look at. In 2010 was the tipping point, and if you look at 2010 and follow every year since 2010, um, I don't rule the pandemic in here just because it overlays a bias that we don't that
Yeah.
is really something unique. But literally every year, if you follow earlier, the increasing early deaths started in 2010 and 2011, more early deaths than 2010, more in 2012, more in 2013. On balance, we also had some people living longer. And so that's why if you look at the life expectancy trajectory from the US, it went up, you could say through the 20th century. By 2000, it the slope started to go down as it has in many countries, but we're on a slower trajectory. in 2010, we literally hit a plateau. And, just the noise in the curve, depending on, flu epidemics that were up and down one year can move those numbers around. But it is profound. I don't know anyone else in the country who's looking at that data. I wish I could have some conversations with people to understand or to talk about. There are other things in that data that are absolutely fascinating that relate back to your birth year. That overlay. There's two birth years that stand out as quite profound relative to the rest of the data, post World War II years. But anyway, it's I forget where I was going with that when I got onto it, but it's the whole area here of really understanding what is convenience, right? And we could say it is absolutely great to have convenience, but like everything, we went back to the start, the dose aspect. We can look at convenience as what's an appropriate dose.
Right. And how do we utilize it, right? There's a place for it. I mean, we all need strategic recovery even after stress. And those conveniences are a big part of our ability to recover from stress. And good stress is generally deliberate stress. It's what we choose so we can control that dose and pepper it with that recovery so that we are benefiting from the stress. So the comforts are a big part of this. But the key, as you just pointed out, is that we have made tremendous advances in life expectancy. I think it's right around 27 years in the last century of life expectancy, but we have tapped out all of the public health changes in sanitation, all the things that have enabled that increase in life expectancy. And at this point, our lifestyles are the kind of, I would probably guess after 210, our lifestyles have just gotten so non-health promoting that that intersection of the benefits from the public health advances and drug development and antibiotics and all of these lumped together, but the fact that our lifestyles are just so working against us that we can actually reach a point where we can out harm ourselves above these is really profound, because what it says is we're at that point, or we were as of 2010, that there's no way around taking responsibility for our own health. I mean, that's really where we're at.
Yeah, or the other way that I describe it is medicine can't keep up with the lifestyle degradation that we're imposing on ourselves. Right? We again, we go back to you talked. I think you mentioned normals and norms. It's something I come back to frequently because, like I look at my own childhood was as normal and as perfect as anyone could ask for. I might as well have been in Mayberry RFD, right? As I've got the older I get, I realize my norm is just it keeps expanding and expanding. The more people I encounter, the more situations that I see people surviving and some thriving in areas, places that I wouldn't have even thought about before. So our norms are changing dramatically for all sorts of reasons. Again, I would say over the last century has been the single biggest change. We saw the Industrial Revolution bring significant change relative to I'll say the millennium leading up to that. My oldest son is a history professor, so we get into the changes over, going back a couple thousand years, or going back 10,000 years in some conversations. And so what we trick ourselves into thinking that anything we're doing today is normal. Arguably nothing other than, I'm trying to think of what would we do that would be normal, that like having a grocery store that you could walk to is still a new thing.
Right.
Right. What would be the things that we legitimately could say would be normal? You and I having a conversation, but it would be face to face, like maybe on the phone, but like I was doing video conferencing in its earliest days, long before anyone had heard of Zoom. And I saw what was going to happen with downtown high rises, given what was coming with video conferencing. But so as we think about kind of changing norms, I think it is hard for people, and
And that always a part of our challenge, I think, is, and that's where in the aging space, I try to focus on what do the people who work with the end of life have to teach us, right?
Mm.
If you could learn, if you could pass that information forward, what would you do? And so that's why I try to work with gerontologists, elder law attorneys, and people who see this every day, that you and I kind of get caught in our daily lives of what we think is normal. Um, so let's if we could kind of maybe let me ask you a little bit to go a little bit deep here for a minute in terms of when we talk about cellular repair, and then maybe we can bring it back and talk about the individual stressors in terms of those types. You touched on them briefly, but I think it'd be good to kind of spend a little bit of time on each one and give people some measure in terms of plants and heat therapy and things. But let's kind of go a little bit. We'll geek out for a minute and get into cellular repair if we could, and kind of talk about when that happens and generally, yeah, you pick any example you like. We're not going to get into all the different types of cells for sure, but just to give people a flavor for the things that are happening in our bodies that we have absolutely no awareness of.
Sure. When our bodies are exposed to stress, the first important thing to know is that our stress response isn't simply fight or flight. That's such an oversimplification of what's
Again,
happening.
there's the binary adaptation people want to overlay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we now know with a lot of cell-based and molecular technology that stress ripples down to the level of our cells. And for hours, even days, and through a lifetime, through epigenetic changes, the changes that happen at the cellular level are occurring. And we have seven cellular stress response. And the net effect of those cellular stress responses is what I call the four R's. We resist damage, we repair damage, we recycle components in our cells, and we recharge our cells. So those stress responses enable us to resist inflammation and oxidative damage. They enable us to repair DNA and proteins. They enable us to recycle components of cells that are old or damaged and salvage the usable parts and use the rest for energy. And they enable us to produce more energy. And that is really the ultimate, most important part of cellular health. Our bodies need to be able to convert chemical energy from food into cellular energy in the form of ATP for our body to perform any of its basic functions. So, through good stress, through these four R's, you're activating these cellular stress responses. And that is how we are repairing, rejuvenating, and renewing our body. And one way to think about this is when we are going through our day, we're invariably going to incur damage. For example, we get 10,000 hits of damage to our DNA in a given day. That's 7 times a minute. I mean, it's really profound how our bodies are constantly trying to heal without us realizing it. And there's a lot of interest in, well, how do we curb the damage that's happening? How do we change our food environment, environmental pollutants, the pesticides, what's in our cosmetics, all the toxins in our world? And there's, certainly utility in trying to change the things that are damaging our cells. But when you're using good stress, you're looking at the other side of the equation. You're saying, how can I boost my ability to repair the damage that's happening every day? How do I activate my body's ability to clean up the damage? And right now we're in a state where the we're not in balance. We're getting the damage, but we're not activating these repair mechanisms. So we're kind of tilting towards disease. And it should be said that the reason all this matters is when our cells are dysfunctional, when they are damaged, that is ultimately why we develop symptoms. And if we don't listen to our bodies and listen to those symptoms, that becomes chronic disease. And if we don't really listen at that point and say, why did I develop this disease? And what can I do to change the path of that disease? That leads to premature aging. So these are the same mechanisms. So why it matters, why we should even care about ourselves is because they underlie our entire health. They are the micro version of what is happening to us throughout our lifetime. And as we go upstream to try and get to the very root of what makes us feel crummy and what makes us get sick, ultimately it's cellular damage. And you can't go any further upstream. That is the most fundamental unit in our body. And that is why we need to care about our cellular health.
Yeah, and so if we think about kind of what the cells need to be able to perform these functions, maybe just before you answer that, and just to kind of go back and confirm something. So you mentioned about DNA damage for something, and that probably may cause some people some angst. Maybe you can talk about kind of normal DNA damage versus, I'll say, toxic or induced or overlaid lifestyle DNA damage, because both are in play, right?
But they're both in play, right? I mean, certainly a lot of environmental exposures that can affect our DNA, but simply in the process of our cells multiplying, there's going to be some DNA damage. Like our bodies are not 100% efficient with any function in the process of making energy in our mitochondria. We release about 1% of free radicals in our body. If our mitochondria are impaired, that number is higher. But even in the functions of basic living, we incur some damage. And at some level, we also have a basal amount of these repair mechanisms. It's just that the good stressors are raising us above that basal amount to a point where we can improve our health. We can build reserves so we are more resilient and can withstand a bigger hit to our health down the road.
Right. And that ties right back to, I think we said the top of the show, we talked about that body's innate ability to heal itself, right? This is kind of where we're coming from. It's built in. It's a question of what's the rate of damage versus the rate of repair. So maybe we could kind of look at now over the course of the lifetime where we start to develop decades. So one of the things that we see happen over the course of one's life as they get, in each advancing decade, one of them is you're doing we'll say you're doing many of the right things. There's still opportunity for significant improvement. But in terms of what those cells need to do the repair cycle, beyond simply food energy, right? So we talk about food energy. Maybe you can talk about, because that really, when I look at it, what are the things that we're doing to slow the aging process? So I'm looking once more from there in terms of what are the chemicals that the body produces that essentially affect that rate of cellular ability or capacity of cellular repair. So I'm looking like BDNF and nitric oxide and all the things your body needs both to function and to repair, right? Over the course of life as we age, and what we see with those naturally will decline unless we get active and then start to do these things we're talking about, right?
100%. Yeah, there are really two parts to what is leading to cellular damage. The aging process alone is going to create, impairment in mitochondria, reduced autophagy, things that lead to cellular dysfunction. Add to that is our Western lifestyle. And that's the part that we have the control over. So I think that, your point's really well made. I mean, invariably, we can't always keep the damage in balance with the repair, because that if we figured that out, we would live to be indefinite,
Yeah.
whatever that expansion of lifespan would be. So, what we're trying to do is improve the quality of our life and improve our health throughout our life. It's really a different mindset. Instead of playing defense, you're playing offense with your health.
Right, right. Yeah, that's why, and the older we get, the number one risk factor is often when we look at a list of things is age, right?
Yes.
And that's really what you're getting at is there's a certain normal component to it, but it's also can be significantly influenced. And that's where I kind of look like and say it's relatively easy to add a decade over the median lifespan by just doing some fairly straightforward and obvious things. It doesn't require, a cabinet full of supplements and taking all sorts of or shots of whatever. But so anyway, so let's kind of go in, if we could, a little bit around the plant toxins, exercise, thermal exposure, fasting, and psychological challenges. Those we kind of list out as different types of stressors. So maybe you can kind of walk us through each of those in whatever order you like.
I'll start with plant toxins because I find this really fascinating. So plants make phytochemicals. I'm referring to the phytochemicals as toxins because the reason plants make phytochemicals is to make themselves more resistant. That's their stress response. When plants are exposed to drought, to UV light, but also to humans and insects, they make phytochemicals as a way to deter us from eating the plant. Hence, they are meant to be somewhat toxic to us. That builds the plant's stress resistance. When we consume that phytochemical, our body builds stress resilience. So our bodies have adapted over millennia with our plant world, and our relationship to food is just so fascinating because we've co-evolved where when we eat these plants, our bodies have developed ways to rapidly detoxify and ramp up their antioxidant defenses to get less oxidative damage against these plant toxins. That became a necessity for our survival because, in order to not starve, our ancestors had to have whatever edible foods that they could put their hands on. And the Homo sapiens diet of our ancestors had over 3,000 plant species. And when we consume that plant, our bodies activate the stress response to make us more resistant so that we could consume more of these plant food. And lucky for us, we've inherited this amazing ability. All these cellular stress responses that we just talked about that improve our ability to repair and regenerate our cells are activated by exposure to plant toxins. And these are natural plant toxins. I should definitely differentiate this from synthetic toxins that are also entering our food supply. So we're talking about the natural plant toxins. And I think the profound part to me is that we think of fruits and vegetables as giving us antioxidants, right? If you eat the color of the rainbow, then you are getting more abundant antioxidants. Hormesis is showing us that the plant food is giving our cells the signal to activate our own antioxidant defenses, that we have the capability to have a very strong and robust antioxidant defense to detoxify exposures. And interestingly enough, when you add up the amount of antioxidants that we get from plant food, it's generally in the nanomolar amount, and we need about a micromolar amount to have the appropriate defenses. So the numbers don't always add up. I mean, they do with certain classes of phytochemicals like polyphenols, but not with a lot of the phytochemicals. And it's so profound that we have it in us to activate these antioxidant defenses. The food is simply the message that our cells need for our bodies to do the work. And phytochemicals are in every plant food. So, how does this look in daily life? Well, this is fairly simple. It's a lot of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds. I mean, this is not an argument for a particular diet type. This is not pro vegan, pro vegetarian. You can have an omnivore diet. All you have to do is add plants. And the key here is that simply adding on the background of any diet you prefer or are following right now, that you are simply adding to your body's ability to fight disease.
Yeah, so again, I'll go back. I'm sorry if I'm going to beat this one to death, but the marathon would be that example of it's the routine practice that ultimately allows the body to perform at its best level, right? So, which goes to the whole variety of foods, which you mentioned, like the rainbow. It's again, it's not which is the best, which is the best fruit or the best vegetable. They're all, or many of them are very good, and in variety that's the best versus trying to think that, well, if I just really like this one, if I just eat that, then I'll be good. Well,
Such an important point.
right, you're really limiting yourself and what your body can do with it, and potentially even tone it down in terms of or dampen the response. So let's kind of if we go over to maybe on the exercise thing and in terms of stress that I know I used the marathon example. You probably have much better one. So in terms of how that works on in terms of hormesis and the cells.
Yeah, if we looked at the example at a cellular level, exercise can trigger mitohormesis, which is a specific type of hormesis that occurs in our mitochondria. And as I mentioned, mitochondria are critical because they produce the energy in our body. And we're also realizing that mitochondria are ultimately the communication hubs in our body. They form a network, kind of like our life force, communicating cell to cell, communicating to our circadian rhythm, communicating to our gut microbes. And so they seem to have a very critical role in our entire body's coordination. And when we exercise, we are giving our bodies a signal to make more mitochondria. Our body rapidly depletes energy, and that sets off certain sensors at a molecular level, like AMPK, other sensors that are these energy sensors. And that tells our body that we need to make more mitochondria. That increases our ability to make energy. And again, this is so critical because it not only increases our energy making capability, but when we exercise at high intensity, we also trigger a process called mitophagy, which is selectively taking the the mitochondria and recycling and renewing the damaged mitochondria. So we are not just producing more energy, we're producing cleaner energy. We're improving our cellular engines. And, so often I get asked by my patients who are fatigued and tired, well, what should I eat? And sometimes the answer is that no matter, you could be eating caviar or whatever deluxe organic food, if your cellular engines are impaired, your body doesn't have the ability to produce energy no matter what you feed it. So, this mitohormesis, which exercise is the most potent way to engage, is such a critical part of maintaining health that I wish every doctor's office actually had a way of testing for mitochondrial impairment. I mean, we do in an indirect way. I mean, metabolic disease is essentially mitochondrial impairment, but we're doing it at a later state. But it's such a critical part of avoiding chronic disease and knowing if we're on that pathway. Right now, 93% of Americans have some level of metabolic dysfunction. So this really matters to almost all of us.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was thinking the other parallel example would be like people who focus on protein intake, as though eating more protein is going to translate into more muscle, which would, we'd say muscle's good because it's going to help with mitochondria, but no, it's without the exercise, the body doesn't know what to do with it, right? It's going to discharge it as waste product.
Right, right. There have been actually some really intriguing studies looking at increasing protein intake and adding exercise in the same study and finding that people who are at the zero level of exercise and protein intake have minimal, if any, effect on developing muscle, and that the trigger for using that protein is essentially the resistance training. um, Too much protein, just like too much anything, can, always have a downside, right? In the case of protein, our body just converts it to fat. I mean, we
Right.
have to utilize, the, the food in some capacity. So absolutely. And that's, but the point is also very well made that we need the muscle mass to improve our mitochondrial function because a lot of aerobic and endurance exercises like marathon training require strong muscle. And aerobic fitness, which is probably our best measure of mitochondrial function right now, needs to be powered by strong muscle. So I think there's, certainly an important role of protein in all of this, but it is, like you just said, it's such a part of this larger picture of how do we get to our healthiest state.
Yeah, and as we're talking there, maybe it's a good time to kind of point to, again, another parallel would be, as you mentioned, around in terms of muscle production or energy production from mitochondria would be not surprising in that VO2 max is closely tied to mitochondrial function, right? You can't have a high VO2 max and have low mitochondrial function because they're so intimately connected. So the whole picture there. So maybe before we go on to the next, you mentioned about high intensity training, interval training. Maybe you can just kind of talk about that a little bit because it's one I'm always careful of answering because it's so audience specific in terms of who's asking the question. So I think we know that the committed exercise group know what that is and the value. I kind of put it to the everyone would benefit, I think, where you're at as well. But there's a way to get there. And I think you've got some ideas around kind of helping people who haven't been active, who are tempted to take the shortcut and then kind of potentially get tripped up. So what would you suggest for a person who says, okay, I've heard enough about it. Tell me how to get there because I don't want to hurt myself.
Yeah. I'll say that high intensity is really what's high intensity to you. And that's going to be very different for someone who is trained to do marathons versus someone who's sedentary, right? Just simply going to the mailbox can be high intensity for someone who's starting with a baseline of sedentary or is older because it's going to get the heart rate up to a zone that is high enough to be considered vigorous or high intensity. How you get there, I think that the key here is that you can first of all build a base. So when we're talking about starting somewhere, building your aerobic capacity, you're building mitochondria, and ultimately that is the base that you need to really push yourself to get to that higher cardiorespiratory fitness with the higher intensity. So if a person's just starting from a sedentary standpoint, you can certainly do several months of just building that strong base by just doing what you can do. It could be a 5-minute walk, which then becomes a 10-minute walk, which can be a 20-minute walk. But interestingly enough, there have been studies taking sedentary people and introducing them straight into high intensity. In those studies, though, the high intensity is generally things like changing how a person walks in terms of the pace of walking. So there was a lovely study done in Japan where they took one group of middle-aged to older adults and told them to walk at their steady continuous pace, which they were doing daily, and told another group walk in intervals, go as fairly fast for about 3 minutes, then back off, catch your breath, let your heart rate come down, go fast for 3 minutes. Do that for your walking exercise. And they had people exercise the same number of minutes, but at the end of, I believe it was a 4-month study, at the end of that time interval, the people who walked in intervals had a higher cardiorespiratory fitness, which was a higher VO2 max, and lower cardiometabolic risk factors. So simply introducing that interval of pushing the body to a more stressed state created adaptations that made people healthier. So I don't want the term high intensity to kind of turn people away from what we're talking about here, because we're not talking about sprint interval training, kind of going hard, kind of pooping out after 30 seconds. What we're talking about is more like a higher intensity. If you wanted to gauge this, if a scale of 1 to 10 is exercise intensity, moderate intensity is usually like a 5 to 6. And we're talking about going from like a 7 to 9 in terms of how you perceive the difficulty of the exercise. But again, it's what is hard for you. And that is going to change over time as a person develops the adaptations, increases their body's ability to make mitochondria and build their endurance.
I had I think you kind of alluded to it, and I'll give an example. It happened to me quite recently. I had a calf injury, and so I had to take a break from running. But I go out every few days and try and see how it was. And so the one day I decided we were going to go point to point. I was running with my wife, and so clearly running was not a good idea. So I decided, well, I'm going to walk home from there. But I walked at a very different pace, a very deliberate pace, not like I would usually walk when I mean, I'm active and walking. And I was shocked. So, I run pretty frequently. I can go run 7 miles and I don't have any soreness or anything, no recovery really afterwards. So this was about a 3 mile walk, but a very brisk walk, just doing a different exercise in terms of, so it wasn't running, but it wasn't the normal walking. It was walking with a faster pace. I was shocked by the soreness I had for 2 or 3 days following of, so just doing high intensity walking. I've kind of said, well, you're never going to get there walking. I'm saying, no, you can get some intensity walking, not necessarily as high a heart rate as you would with, we're talking about interval training, but it's yeah, we don't, I use the example of CrossFit as the kind of the high intensity interval work. We don't need to be into that necessarily, particularly in the early days. That to me is generally I don't recommend it anyway unless you have a reason to be passionate about it. There's a lot safer ways to get there, and it's fun, right? To get there, and then you get into. I talked earlier about some hormones in terms of the hormone dump. You're going to get after that in terms of how you're going to feel after is going to be pretty good.
You can take any exercise you enjoy and create intervals of high intensity. If you like to be on a bicycle, if you're a cyclist, well, do intervals of high intensity, back off, high intensity, back off. If you like to do elliptical, same thing. Take any exercise. I mean, you can do high intensity with resistance training, get your heart rate up and then back off and catch your breath. I think that the importance is of just pushing past your comfort zone. I mean, that is the Goldilocks zone that we also call the hormetic zone, where we actually benefit from the stress. So it's that middle ground between too much, you can injure yourself, not enough, just as harmful as too much. And we all just want to go a little past our comfort zone and then let the body recover. A little past the comfort zone, body recover, and doing cycles of that.
You just keep hitting on buzzwords that I talk about in class all the time, and that's so one is comfort zone is like in learning, right? As we get to be adults, like if I've got to get you out of your comfort zone for you to learn anything. That's everything I've learned is really outside my comfort zone. It's kind of like that normal thing, right? You need to keep expanding it, and it's only once you get outside that's where you start to get the benefits. So playing it safe all the time generally isn't going to get you there. So you talked a little bit about fasting, thermal. I'm going to go in the series that you gave me here. So thermal exposure in terms of so to my Canadian roots, we know all about cold exposure, and then we go south. I'm reminded of went to Florida, went there, no Texas, San Antonio, went from Canada down to San Antonio, and golfing. I went from the cold to the heat, and both are difficult. But talk to me about the health benefits of what that type of cycling is.
Yeah, you did your body good. When we are exposed to either extreme of cold or heat, it changes our body's core temperature, right? So instead of 98.7 Fahrenheit, depending on if you look at this Fahrenheit or Celsius, but we are changing our body's core temperature either up or down depending on the exposure. And our body likes to have a homeostatic balance, with homeostasis kind of being this state where our body is in balance. And when we are out of that range, that our body functions optimally, our body has these feedback mechanisms that just kick in to get our body back into its homeostatic range. With temperature, in that process of our body kicking in, if we're exposed to cold, it kicks in with thermogenesis, and we can get into the mechanisms of that. But essentially, think of your muscles as shivering as a way to generate heat. Our body has brown fat, which is our internal space heater that gets activated. It's to generate heat to get us back to our core body temperature. With heat, our body wants to cool us off. So we shunt blood to the periphery, to our extremities, where we can sweat off that excess heat. In the process of our bodies restoring natural temperature, that is where we get the health benefit. So, like I mentioned with cold, we activate shivering and we activate brown fat. Well, shivering slightly raises our metabolism. So does brown fat. Brown fat is very different than white fat. White fat stores energy. Brown fat burns it. So it burns triglycerides, it burns glucose. And you can see how that could help our metabolic health. We don't have a lot of it, but we know that through repeat cycles of cold recovery, we can increase the volume of our brown fat pretty significantly. Like over 10 days, there are studies showing we can increase it by 37%. And so we get a metabolic benefit. And then at a cellular level, we activate these cellular stress responses that we're talking about. Similarly, with heat, at the level of our physiology, as our body is shunting the blood to the periphery, to our, fingers, and helping us evaporate that heat, there's a type of stress it creates on our blood vessels called shear stress. And that shear stress helps our endothelial cells, the cells that line the 60,000 miles of blood vessels that are coursing through our body, in a way that improves the release of nitric oxide, which is this incredibly powerful chemical our endothelial cells make that help dilate our blood vessels. They have antiplatelet activity, so we reduce our risk of blood clots. As we make these endothelial cells healthier and raise our nitric oxide level, our risk of developing, atherosclerotic disease decreases. So heat actually almost mimics moderate to vigorous exercise. That is how much it raises our heart rate and raises our blood pressure and gets the blood pumping to our periphery. So just as you would expect, then we get very similar benefits as exercising in terms of that heart risk reduction, which is just incredibly profound. And then there's another layer and story to be told at what's happening at a cellular level, right? We get the spike in heat shock proteins, which help repair our proteins, and we get the cellular repair mechanisms kicking in as well. So heat and cold are very underutilized as a lifestyle tool. Like you mentioned, diet and exercise, well, they're center stage, and they should be, because I don't want to have people think the magnitude of the benefit of heat and cold matches the magnitude of the benefit from the diet and exercise. But I do think that we have different modalities where we can get to this end point of becoming healthier.
Yeah, and if it's kind of like the example, you could say like, if it takes no more time to do it, whether it's, walking across the parking lot instead of getting the closest parking spot you can, you can't measure the difference in time over the course of how you've used your energy and time over the day. There's lots of things. You could go outside without a jacket for a minute in the winter, and step back inside as soon as you get cold. As you're talking about the heat therapy, I'm thinking of like when I go in my infrared sauna, and it's literally like I feel fine. I'm watching the temperature coming up. And it's almost like somebody flipped a switch and all of a sudden sweat starts. It is, so it's right. You kind of say the balance. Okay, now it's switched into another mode where it's now starting to produce sweat to try to bring my core temperature. It's got the signal. So that's part of what I find so fascinating about this. As you start to listen to your body, you mentioned earlier, it starts to get fascinating. I had a conversation just yesterday with someone, late 60s, who's really just starting to get excited about all the things, got an Apple Watch and got some other things happening around health that had really not paid any attention. And now is just kind of like, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
which is great to see that, right? So the other you talked to well, a little bit, maybe just come back to it for a minute, was real around fasting, I was curious if you've heard Walter Longo talk about fasting recently, because I'm finding his message has changed a little bit, and it sounds like it lines up much closer with where you and I are on fasting in terms of kind of what's the normal routine that you'd suggest for fasting and why that is versus some of the extremes maybe that we see people feeling that, well, I can't, if I can't do the extreme, like then I'm not going to get any value, or if I'm going to do it, I have to do the extreme, or the different personalities that play out.
Yeah, what I advocate for is eating in a window that's 12 hours or less, and to try and front load those calories earlier in the day, trying to end eating or caloric intake 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. And the reason for that is from a hormetic standpoint, that is how we can optimize ourselves. When we eat, currently, right now in this country, we're eating over a 15-hour window. And when we eat, we raise our insulin level. We tell our body that we need to be in a growth state. And growth sounds wonderful, except when growth isn't balanced with repair, it can lead to damage. And when growth isn't balanced with breakdown, it can lead to excess storage, like excess fat storage, excess sugar storage. So it's not always a good thing. When we eat in a window that is when we go more than 12 hours without eating, our bodies start to utilize fat instead of sugar. So there's a switch that happens where instead of utilizing glucose or glycogen, our body makes ketones as its source of energy, and we start to use our internal store. And without that switch from buildup to breakdown, we're in the state of excess buildup. And that is wreaking havoc in terms of our metabolic health, higher rates of obesity, blood sugar imbalances, and metabolic disease can lead to heart disease. So we need to restore that balance. And that's why that 12 hours is critical. And at a cellular level, when we go past the 12 hours and our body makes these ketones, ketones are a signaling molecule. They communicate to our cells to start these stress resistant functions. When our body is exposed to the stress of going more than 12 hours without eating, it hunkers down. It learns to use energy more efficiently. So we become more insulin sensitive. We uptake sugar, we uptake fats, and it starts these repair mechanisms so that when we recover, when we then eat, we are preferentially growing these healthier cells. So this is this pattern of fasting recovery from time restricted eating of 12 hours or less, and then eating in the day. You're really regenerating your cells, cleaning up, doing all these housekeeping functions, and then growing these healthy cells. This is the balance that we need to maintain for maintaining our health. I think right now what we're doing is we are not only eating in 15 hours, but 45% of those calories are coming at dinner and after dinner. And the downside to that is that it disrupts our circadian biology. So not only do we want to balance this growth and repair, but we also want to align our eating with our circadian biology, because our body has a certain time where it's optimized to do certain functions. In the daytime, we're optimized to move, to think, to do our daily tasks. In the evening and at nighttime, we're optimized to repair and heal. When we eat later in the day, we start to interfere with that natural pattern. So instead of our body being able to do the repair that it does overnight while we're sleeping, it's still ramping up all that it needs to for our digestive processes. And we also now know that we have different clocks in our body. So we have a central clock, which is in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that gets light exposure, and when it's dark, it kind of shuts down. That's our master clock. But we have peripheral clocks in every part of our body, in every organ, in every cell. Clocks in our gut microbiome, clocks in our liver, etc. And these peripheral clocks are entrained by our meal timing. When we eat late at night, when our body, our clock, is trying to unwind and shut down, our body's operating in two different time zones. It's getting this really confusing signal that starts to dampen our circadian function, and it makes every function of our body less efficient. We think less efficiently. Everything from metabolic disease to menstrual irregularities to anxiety, depression can stem from this inefficiency we're creating by disrupting our circadian biology. So the timing of our meals is really critical. And this is why a while back I mentioned I call this normal eating, because what we are doing today is actually pretty radical from our body's perspective, right? We're telling it to constantly grow, we're not giving it time to repair, and we're jet lagging our body. And the normal is essentially doing this time restricted eating.
Yeah, it's yeah. So the engineer in me will kick in and say, if I told you you need, I'm going to take away 30% of your time to do anything in the course of a day, you would feel it. Whatever, what I don't care what. Like, I'm going to take away time that just from you. That's essentially what you're doing if you continue to eat later in the day, because there's only so many hours during sleep, and that's really where we're talking about the cellular repair. And then the other one, which clearly a lot of my students pay attention to, is the cognitive repair, which is in the longevity world, right? All the things you're talking about or we're talking about today are still focused in fairly the acute function on that 24-hour cycle, 24-hour cycle. And if we look at the basic survival mechanisms, they're built around the priority of getting the next breath, the next heartbeat, getting you through the next hour, getting you through to tomorrow. But when we think about the longevity world where we're in, where we have this opportunity to live longer, what's most at risk in later years, or what certainly becomes at risk in later years, is cognitive function. And in the priorities of things in the body that happen during sleep, cognitive reorganizing and shelving is not the top priority for our brains or for our bodies as much as we would like it to be. That's really what we're stealing from. And we're seeing more studies starting to show it's not as simple as, the person who gets 9 hours sleep is guaranteed to be, 50% less likely than the person who gets 7 hours sleep. But we certainly see these patterns of behavior come out in all sorts of things. If you essentially take away 30% of your opportunity to do the repair cycle that biology brought us to this point, there will be consequences. How they emerge and when will be a bit of a guess, but the likelihood is going to be much higher. So now the last one was, which I thought was really interesting, because this is one I haven't really thought much about, is psychological changes or challenges in terms of hormesis and how that plays out. I've been saving the best for last, so I want to hear this one.
Yeah. So psychological challenges really work like all these other physical challenges. And I will also say that back to our comment about synergy, you can start anywhere, and each of these stressors help the other. And the reason I love talking about this is when we are trying to build our resilience to psychological stress, a lot of the tools that we currently use are things like meditation and mindfulness, which help us manage our current stress. And I think they're incredibly important, but they don't work for every person. And what we're talking about is using modalities like the phytochemicals, the high intensity interval training, heat, cold, as ways to make ourselves more resilient. And that is another pathway to building our psychological resilience. Interestingly enough, our mitochondria are actually the part of our cells that release the catecholamines, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. When we are using physical stressors like exercise to make our mitochondria healthier, we're improving our body's ability to regulate our stress response. So we're really connecting the mind and body, and that's the commonality of bringing this all together. And this is a phenomenon of cross adaptation where you can use the mind to help the body and the body to help the mind in terms of getting to that state of higher resilience. The question that seems to come up for a lot of people is, well, what makes stress good? Like, what is a good psychological challenge? And what is one that's harmful? I'll start with the harmful because that is the one that unfortunately is the more familiar one to most people. So, the harmful stress is the continuous chronic stress that our bodies simply weren't made to handle. Things like a difficult relationship, financial uncertainty, working in a job that is not your dream job. These are just the day-to-day stressors, and their chronicity is what leads to the harm, the inflammation in our body. The stress that is beneficial, like we've mentioned in all these other aspects, it's brief and it's intermittent, and the key is that it's deliberate. You get to choose the type of psychological challenge. And the kinds that are health promoting are ones that align with your personal beliefs. They are purposeful and meaningful. They're generative. They're part of something bigger than you. When you get in a situation stressful that meets these criteria, the biochemistry of your stress response is very different than the threat based fight or flight response. You're releasing dopamine, the reward hormone, oxytocin, which is dubbed the cuddle hormone if you're doing a generative type of stress. You can release serotonin if it gives you joy. These chemicals are the trifecta of reducing cortisol. So it's an alternate way of essentially using stress to build stress resilience, which is really so counterintuitive in our toolbox right now of how we handle the chronic stress in our life.
Yeah, the I can think of all sorts of examples as you're speaking about that, and it's again I kind of put it in getting out of your comfort zone by choice,
Yes.
right? These are the things that happen. I was talking to somebody yesterday, telling a story of a woman 60 wanted to climb Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
You know, was not an athlete, no background at all, but this was the idea, and so which took the conversation. And once, of course, she'd done that, it's like now I can do all sorts of things, right? So this is the same adaptation we see happen, and you can think it's just a confidence, but there's more to it than that. That things because you've been there and survived it, you're able to come back to it now with far less anxiety and far more resilience. That we keep coming back to that word resilience.
We do. And what I want to emphasize is resilience is kind of thought of as this mushy term, this ill defined, I'm stronger, I'm more resilient because I've gone through some adversity. What we're talking about is that we are literally rewiring and reconfiguring our mind and our body so that we are capable of handling future stress better. This is the biological change that is happening to explain how we are becoming stronger. So it's not just a feeling. Our bodies are getting more capable. They're increasing their capacity, and that's what we want.
Right. We think of like neuroplasticity, the same thing. Like the body has ways to remap things. Again, it's adapting to a request that we make of it. The first
Yeah.
time may be difficult, and we may not, we may fail by what our expectations were going in. We come back and we get to that same point and realize, oh, I can go further, right? And we can. So it's this remapping that happens all sorts of times. But if we stick to the world of convenience and never kind of go there, it's very hard to build these other mechanisms that are waiting inside to be tapped into.
Right. And the key here is that this is not about grit or persevering in situations where you're stuck, right? This is very different. This is a story of hope. It's a story of freedom. It's really, our bodies are made for us to do hard things. This is what you are capable of. We all have this ability. This is not for just a small subset of people. And I hope that this gives people that kind of freedom to say yes, freedom to push themselves to that higher state where they're capable of living a life that has more meaning, that has better health. So I think that's the key here. You don't want to persevere in situations where you're stuck. We're talking about choosing your stress And this is where this good stress versus bad stress, for lack of better terms, it plays a role. And differentiating between the two of those is really critical.
Yeah, I kind of use the opportunity whenever I can to remind people that most of us will never come anywhere near tapping into our capacity or our capabilities. We generally kind of again operate in this safe mode for all sorts of reasons, and it's not to say that we should be on the edge all the time. But if I kind of, again, when I look at what older adults are able to do, it really just, I know again, we focus on Olympic athletes. A lot of times they get the media coverage or pro athletes. But like, and I see it in myself, I can measure myself against my peers and say, oh, I should feel pretty good about it. And I do, but I know there's still a lot of capacity in a lot of areas that I just have not even begun to tap in. Even that example I said where I run normally and I walked, right? That was a surprise. I remember coming off an Ironman, going in to do CrossFit training, and was shocked by a whole bunch of muscles and movements that I hadn't been training, even though I was working in multi-sport, thinking, okay, it's not like a runner just doing one thing. So this exists everywhere. And it's just as soon as you step outside and kind of choose an area or one or more areas to pursue, I think that's where this opportunity is. And that's, I think, absolutely, I think you hit it, this is a story of hope. Everyone should feel inspired to stop and say, what is it that I've kind of maybe thought about doing, or tomorrow something happens that comes across our eyes and catches our attention to say, I bet I could do that for whatever reason. Right? It doesn't matter why. That doesn't have to be logic. And I think what is so exciting about your work is it really supports this in terms of the science, in terms of the biology, in terms of we didn't get too much into genetics and epigenetics. Maybe we can do that another day. But it's just such a great story of hope, and I'm just so glad to hear you speaking to it so eloquently. It's just been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Scott. And, I'll just add to that hormesis has been studied across different species with different exposures. And through this pattern of stress recovery, repeat, we can increase our potential 60 to 90%, which is really profound, right? It's almost a doubling of our human capacity and our potential. So just trust that you were made to do hard things and lean into it, because that is where our natural gifts just shine.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful message to leave with the audience. Thank you so much, Sharon, for taking time again to spend with me and with our group here today. It's just been a wonderful conversation again, and I hope we can pick it up again in the future.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you so much for inviting me to join.
And good luck with the book. I'm excited to see the reception that it's going to get. So we'll make sure we include links for that down below.
Excellent. And anyone who wants to learn more can also learn from my website, drsharonbergquist.com, and there are links to the book from my website. So thank you so much.
Terrific. Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.